Wealth is like a dazzling light that blinds a person. And when that light finally goes out, leaving you in the dark, only then do you begin to see who your true friends and enemies are. Though sometimes it's already too late. My own sister Vivienne stood proudly at the very peak of that glittering world until one day she lost everything and found herself cast out onto the freezing streets. And in that moment, not a single one of those she trusted even bothered to open their door to her. Vivienne and I were sisters, but it was as if we had been born into different worlds. Even as a little girl, she wanted the most expensive dresses, the wealthiest friends, and she always looked down on my ordinary life, as though simplicity were something temporary, a dull stopover before the grand life she was meant to have. And when she finally found the wealth she'd always chased by marrying a rich businessman, she severed what little thread of connection she still had with us. She no longer called on holidays, nor did she ever invite her poor relatives to that grand mansion of hers. We simply didn't fit the glittering world she'd built for herself. For years, I waited, hoping that one day her heart might soften, that perhaps for the sake of old memories, she'd call just to say hello. But whenever I rang, during sickness, during hardship, it was always her maid who answered, or I'd hear, "Mrs. Vivienne has guests at the moment." I wasn't after her money. I only longed for a sip of sisterly affection. But fate, it seems, has its own justice. The mountains she trusted were soon covered in snow. Her husband's sudden bankruptcy toppled her kingdom overnight, and the woman who had walked the world like a queen found herself out in the cold, penniless, clutching a suitcase on a stranger's doorstep. True to form, the first door she knocked on wasn't mine, not her sister's modest little house, but that of her wealthy friend, a glamorous socialite with whom she'd once spent every weekend shopping for jewelry. Vivienne still believed she belonged to that world, convinced that her downfall was only temporary. But the intercom's voice was colder than the winter air. "Madame isn't at home." That was the first slap she received. Just a week earlier, they had been clinking glasses of champagne together. Her friend laughing, saying, "You're my dearest. If you're ever in trouble, call me first." Apparently, those words only applied to the Vivienne who still had money. That day she spent calling everyone in her precious contact book. One by one, some didn't answer, some mumbled, "I'm in a meeting, I'll call you later," and never did. And some, having heard of her husband's ruin, hung up as though poverty were contagious. In that shallow world, a woman without wealth simply ceased to exist. Her greatest heartbreak came when she turned at last to her own daughter, the child she'd raised like a princess, sent to the finest schools, the very pride of her life. When the girl opened the door and saw her mother, disheveled and shivering, she said, "Mom, not now. My husband's home. I can't upset things. I'll send you some money later." And she closed the door, leaving her mother out in the freezing night. That night, for the first time in her life, Vivienne slept on the streets.
And as the cold pierced her to the bone, she finally understood how empty her treasures, her friends, and her family's approval had been. But by then, she had nowhere left to go, or so she thought.
After hours of desperate wandering and countless doors slammed in her face, her feet carried her at last to the one place she had vowed never to return, the old neighborhood where I'd lived all my life. The one she used to sneer at and call the slums, because when life brings you to your knees, when you've nowhere left to go, you end up knocking on the very door you once despised. I could almost feel her presence before the doorbell rang, as though I sensed her standing there for minutes, paralyzed, wrestling with her pride. I could imagine that trembling hand hovering over the bell, knowing that pressing it meant more than asking for shelter. It meant admitting defeat, dependence, and the shame of seeking refuge from the sister she'd once looked down upon. When the bell finally rang in the dead of night, my mind raced with dark thoughts. Who could it be at such an hour? And when I opened the door, the drenched, shivering figure before me didn't look real. Could that fragile shadow truly be my proud, cold-hearted sister, Vivienne? It was as though I were staring at the ghost of the woman I once knew. She couldn't meet my eyes. The head that had always been held high was bowed, and that commanding voice of hers was reduced to a whisper. "Margaret, I've nowhere to go." In that instant, I realized life had stripped her not only of her wealth, but also of her pride, the very thing she'd built herself upon. Before me stood not the wealthy Vivienne, but a broken, homeless woman. For a moment, I forgot the years of cruelty, the sharp words, the calls cut short, the silences, because she was still my sister, my own blood. And no matter what she'd done, I couldn't leave her out there in the rain. So I stepped aside and opened wide the door she had once called too small for a lady like her. When she stepped from the marble floors of her mansion onto my worn linoleum, I saw her whole body tighten. The shame of taking refuge in the very house she'd mocked was written on every line of her face. I showed her the bathroom, handed her a clean nightdress that had once belonged to my daughter, and a simple towel. I watched how her manicured fingers hesitated to touch the plain cotton fabric, as though poverty itself might rub off on her. Perhaps for the first time, she understood that what she'd always called poverty was for me simply cleanliness and enough. While she changed, I went into the kitchen and reheated the only warm meal I had, a bowl of lentil soup. I wondered when she'd last eaten something so humble. At her lavish dinners, such a dish would have been dismissed as servant's food. When I set the bowl before her, I watched those trembling, jewel-covered fingers reach for the spoon, and in that moment, I saw how hunger and cold could bring even the proudest person to their knees, how a taste accustomed to champagne and truffles could come to crave a single bowl of hot soup. That night, I made her bed on the old sofa in my small living room. She who had slept all her life in silk sheets would now rest on my creaking couch. As I spread the clean, soap-scented sheets over her,
I couldn't help but think how strangely fate had leveled us. Two sisters, once worlds apart, now sharing the same weary roof, bound at last by fragility.
When morning came and she opened her eyes on that creaking old sofa, she saw not the silk sheets of her lavish bedroom, but the flannel quilt I'd bought from the market. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't a nightmare she could wake from. The look on her face told me everything. Waking up in my modest home felt to her like a punishment even harsher than sleeping on the streets. A woman who'd once been accustomed to marbled bathrooms and shelves lined with expensive lotions now had to wash herself with a bar of perfumed soap from my single tiny bathroom. To her, that was poverty in its most tangible form, a thing you could see, touch, and smell. And every movement she made betrayed how unbearable she found it, as though simply being in my home somehow soiled her. When I set a cup of hot tea before her, along with a few olives, a bit of cheese, and bread, she stared at them as though I'd placed poison on the plate. Perhaps she was remembering those breakfasts of smoked salmon and champagne that used to grace her table. What she'd forgotten, though, was that this humble meal, the bread and cheese she scorned, was the only reason she wasn't still hungry out on the street that morning. All day she clung to her expensive phone, calling every name she could think of from her old world. But that phone, once her ticket to influence, had become nothing more than a cruel reminder of the life she'd lost. No one called her. None of those so-called friends even asked, "Vivienne, are you all right?" Without money, she simply no longer existed to them. While I bustled about the house, she sat on that sofa like a fallen princess, idle from morning till night, never offering to help, never once showing a hint of shame for being a burden. It was as if my home were some shabby hotel, and I her unpaid maid. Her empire of pride had collapsed, but even its ruins still towered over me. After a few days, once the initial shock had passed, that timid, broken woman vanished, and the old Vivienne returned, sharp-tongued and venomous. When I set a plate of stew before her one evening, she pushed it away with disgust. "I've never eaten weeds like this in my life. Is this really what you people eat every day?" She would sit in front of my little flickering television, that tinny old thing that was my only comfort, and complain bitterly. "Isn't there anything worth watching on this box? It's enough to drive a person mad in here." She didn't understand that the very box she mocked was my only window to the world. One evening, I brought her a cup of fragrant chamomile tea that a kind neighbor had shared. She wrinkled her nose and said, "My stomach can't handle these peasant teas. Don't you have any proper coffee? At least a bit of filter?" In that moment, I felt my patience splinter. I could sense my passion, once so strong, beginning to rot into anger. All day she continued clinging to that phone, pleading with her ungrateful daughter or those slippery friends. Even while begging for money, she never shed that tone of superiority. "How dare you leave me rotting in this rat hole? Send me some money immediately." Then, when they hung up, she would turn her fury on me, as though I were to blame for her fall. She couldn't even stand my neighbors. When they came to the door with a bowl of hot stew or a kind word,
She'd open it just enough to hiss, "Margaret's not home," and slam it in their faces. Then she'd whirl on me, demanding, "Must I really mix with these dreary people?" She sat there in my house, eating my food, and found the gall to insult my friends, the only people who'd ever stood by me.
The shy awkwardness she'd shown that first night under my roof vanished within a few days, replaced by the same imperious tone that had once ruled her mansion. It was as if I were no longer her sister, the one she'd spent years looking down on, but her last unpaid maid. "Margaret, clean these windows. It's stifling in here. Make a proper dinner tonight, some meat. I'm sick of all these greens." That's when I realized that the word please had disappeared from her vocabulary the same day her fortune vanished. She had no respect even for the small wooden radio that had belonged to my late husband, one of the few things in my home that still held meaning for me. One afternoon, I found her fiddling with its knobs, forcing them with her jeweled fingers. "Why on earth do you keep this useless piece of junk? It only makes noise," she said. At that moment, I saw again how hardened her heart had become, how incapable she was of understanding the value of anything that wasn't expensive. I remember slamming my soapy washing gloves down on the counter, my patience finally snapping after years of silent endurance. "Vivienne," I said, my voice trembling, "this junk you mock, this home, this food, it's what's keeping you from freezing on the streets. And I am not your servant. You can drop that arrogant tongue once and for all." The shock on her face was almost comical. She'd never imagined that the sister she'd always called meek and pitiful would dare to stand up to her. Her cheeks flushed red, not from shame, but from fury, because even under my roof, she still believed she was the lady of the house. After that fight, the silence that filled the home was colder than her shouting had ever been. She stopped speaking to me altogether, answering only when absolutely necessary, spending her days on that sofa like a prisoner, counting down the days, watching me with a deep, smoldering hatred. The next day, still burning with pride and resentment, she called her ungrateful daughter again, but this time her voice had lost all its arrogance. It was trembling and small. "Please, darling," she begged, "take me away from here. Just one night in a hotel. I can't bear staying under your aunt's roof." Her pride found my home more unbearable than the thought of sleeping on the streets. I heard the call end, followed by muffled sobs she tried to hide. Later, I learned that her precious daughter, the one she'd raised like royalty, had replied coldly, "Mom, my husband's furious that you keep calling. Don't contact me again. I've sent you what I can. It's the last time." To withdraw that pitiful amount, Vivienne had to put on one of my old coats, the same one she'd once dismissed as drab, and walk to the local bank. The woman who used to ride in chauffeured cars now trudged through muddy streets, her designer heels sinking into the earth, shrinking under the curious stares of passers-by. Perhaps when she held that small sum in her hand, she felt for a fleeting moment that she was free again, the independent Vivienne she used to be. But it didn't take long to realize that money couldn't buy her even a night in the kind of hotels she once frequented.
It wasn't her freedom. It was the price her daughter paid to be rid of her. She stayed out all day. Maybe she tried to dine in some cheap cafe, pretending for a while that she still belonged to that old world. But when night fell and the cold wind found her again, when the last of the money was gone, she came back. Back to the house she said she couldn't breathe in. Back to the door she had once sworn she'd never need to knock on again.
When my doorbell rang again that night, the woman standing before me no longer carried even the faint flicker of hope she'd had that morning. The illusion of freedom she'd tried to buy with those few pathetic pounds had dissolved into the cold pavements of the city. And now, stripped of pride, of pretense, and worst of all, of her own child's love, she had returned, defeated, hollow, and trembling. She entered without a word. The disdain in her eyes was gone, replaced by a shame so raw she didn't know where to put her hands. She didn't criticize the food, nor the furniture, nor the smell of my small home anymore. That one day of desperation outside had taught her, more cruelly than I ever could, the value of my modest roof. Looking at her, I realized that the cruelty of her daughter, the child she had once adored, for whom she had abandoned her own family, was a punishment far greater than any resentment I had ever harbored. And so my anger began to fade, replaced by a strange pity, because before me no longer stood the rich, arrogant Vivienne, but a frail old mother who had been cast aside by the very person she'd sacrificed everything for. That night, when I covered her with the blanket, I found myself remembering our childhoods, our laughter, our whispered secrets before sleep. Back then, she had slept just as peacefully, long before money and vanity had poisoned her soul, when she was simply my little sister. But as I tucked the blanket around her shoulders, I couldn't help but wonder whether it would be enough to warm the frozen heart beneath. The next morning, perhaps for the first time in her life, she did something ordinary, something I would do. After breakfast, she quietly picked up her plate and placed it by the sink. Such a small gesture, yet it must have taken all the strength she had left. It was her unspoken way of saying, "I surrender." From that day onward, an uneasy truce settled between us. She no longer barked orders, and I no longer reminded her of the past. We were two strangers, learning how to coexist without suffocating each other, bound by circumstance, not affection. Sometimes, as I chopped vegetables in the kitchen, I'd sense her standing silently in the doorway, watching. Her gaze followed my hands, as if trying to understand how simple things were done. Boiling a pot, slicing an onion. It struck me then how helpless her glittering world had left her, how that life of privilege had rendered her utterly dependent and inept. Once, I handed her a dust cloth to help. She didn't remove her rings, those last relics of her vanity, as she took it, fumbling awkwardly, unsure even how to wipe the small wooden table. Who could say what humiliation that simple act carried for her? And as I watched her clumsy hands tremble, I realized that the refinement she'd been so proud of was worthless here. In this house, her manicured fingers had no power at all. Days passed, and the screen of her precious phone remained dark. The daughter she had lived for, the one she had placed on a pedestal above all else, never called, never asked if her mother was alive or dead. Her circle of friends had vanished the moment her fortune had crumbled, and that silence, heavy, unbroken, wounded her more deeply than any harsh word of mine ever could. At night,
I'd hear her turning restlessly on that creaking sofa, sometimes weeping softly when she thought I couldn't hear. Those sleepless nights, spent alone in my humble living room instead of her silk-covered bed, were life's final merciless lessons to her. And in those quiet tears, I saw the last fragile remnants of a fallen kingdom dissolving drop by drop into the dark.
Weeks passed in that house, and the silence between us grew so heavy that it felt as though the air itself refused to move. One evening, I set my knitting needles gently on my lap and decided it was time to summon the past we had both tried so hard to bury. Her quiet tears had begun to drown out the years of pain I had kept locked inside me. She was staring blankly out the window into the darkness when I spoke, my voice calm, neither angry nor pitying, only weary from the weight of years. "Vivienne," I said, "that glittering life you traded us for, the one where you erased our parents' memory with a single stroke, the soirees filled with your false friends, the daughter you adored and defended no matter what. Tell me, as you sit here now on that old sofa, alone and forgotten, was it worth it?" She flinched, startled, and for a moment I saw the old Vivienne resurface, the one with venom in her tongue and pride in her spine. "What do you know of my life?" she spat. "You could never understand what it was like to have respect, to live in luxury. If my husband's business hadn't failed, I'd still be the queen of that world. It wasn't my fault. It was bad luck, nothing more." "Bad luck?" I echoed. Something deep within me cracked. An old scarred wound splitting open once again. "Was it bad luck, Vivienne?" I said, my voice trembling, "when my husband was dying in that hospital and I called you for help, just a little money for his treatment, and you said, 'Margaret, I have a golf tournament. I can't ruin my reputation with your pitiful problems before hanging up on me?' Was that bad luck too? Or was that your cold, heartless choice?" Her sharp tongue, that weapon she'd used all her life, fell silent, because now, right there, in the middle of my humble living room, stood the truth she'd buried for decades, stripped bare and merciless. And for the first time, I saw her crushed beneath it. No wealth, no vanity, no status could defend her now. The air in the room grew dense, almost suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on us. The proud woman who had never bowed her head to anyone sat hunched on that small sofa, broken beneath the weight of her own conscience. In that moment, she wasn't confronting the loss of her fortune. She was confronting the bankruptcy of her humanity. And then she began to cry, not as she had on the night she slept on the streets, but far more deeply, from a place of unbearable grief. She wasn't mourning her lost riches or her ruined status. She was mourning the unforgivable sin of turning her back on her sister, the one who had once begged for help in a hospital corridor. Her sobs didn't echo through my house. They echoed inside the hollow chambers of her own heart. I stood there and watched her. I couldn't bring myself to say, "Don't cry, sister," but neither could I whisper, "You deserve this," because I knew that even the truest of her tears couldn't bring back my husband,
nor erase the loneliness of those years. This was her reckoning, not mine. Her long-delayed, bitter confrontation with her own guilt. When the storm finally subsided, she lifted her swollen red eyes to meet mine. Gone was the arrogance, the fury, the defiance. All that remained was a hollow confession in her gaze. I know I was cruel. I don't deserve forgiveness. There was nothing to say. Words couldn't heal wounds carved by decades. So I simply went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and placed it in her trembling hands. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite. It was something quieter, older, and heavier, a way of saying, I won't drown you in my hatred. You're still my blood, and under this roof, you'll have peace. And in that silence, we both knew that nothing in that house or in our hearts would ever be the same again.
On the morning after that great reckoning, the silence in our house was no longer the tense calm that follows anger. It was the eerie stillness that lingers after an earthquake, when all that remains is the dust and ruin. Vivienne sat on the sofa like a shadow, staring blankly at the cup of tea I had placed in her hands, as if it were the last thing in the world she could still hold on to. Because that night, she had faced not only her past, but the monster within herself. As I busied myself with the small, ordinary tasks of the day, she suddenly stirred from her daze. Her trembling hands reached toward the old dust cloth I was holding. Her voice was faint, cracking with effort. Margaret, please, let me. I'll do a bit. In that moment, I understood this wasn't about helping. It was a desperate act of penance, a feeble attempt to quiet the crushing guilt that had finally broken through her pride. She wanted, in some small way, to earn her place beneath my roof. Watching her clutch that grimy cloth between her ringed fingers, trying and failing to wipe the dust from my modest coffee table, was almost unbearable. Here was a woman who had never washed a glass in her life, who ordered servants around with a raised eyebrow, now struggling to manage the simplest of chores. It was the most painful proof of how far she had fallen from the shining world she once ruled, and how utterly foreign this new one was to her. When she faltered, sweat gathering at her temples, she looked at me, and in her eyes I saw a silent plea. Forgive me, I don't know what to do anymore. But I only turned away and took the bucket from her hands. Leave it, I said, unable to keep the chill from my voice. You're not used to this sort of thing. You'll only get in the way. I'll manage. Her clumsy repentance, however sincere, felt so small compared to what I had lost, so hopelessly insufficient beside the years of pain she had caused. She withdrew to her corner again, and in that moment we both understood. Some sins are too heavy to be repaid in this world. She was no longer the rich sister, nor even a guest in my house, just a ghost of her former self, living under my mercy, a breathing relic of her own mistakes. And I, bound by nothing but the stubborn pull of blood, was forced to give that ghost a place in my home. From that night onward, Vivienne seemed to exist only halfway, her body still present, but her spirit long gone.
She would sit for hours at the window or on the sofa, watching the children playing outside, at the neighbors hurrying to work, watching them with the hollow fascination of someone who no longer belonged to the living. Her once glossy hair, always styled to perfection, now hung limp and oily. The silk blouses she insisted on wearing had faded, drooping around her thinning shoulders. When she passed the mirror, she would stop and stare at her reflection, the stranger staring back at her. The grand lady she'd been was gone. The money had gone with her, and with it, the identity she thought was hers. She no longer mocked my home or turned up her nose at my food. Instead, she became dependent, painfully, childishly dependent. Whenever I prepared to leave for the weekly market, she'd look at me with wild, frightened eyes, silently begging, "Please don't leave me here. What if you don't come back?" It wasn't me she feared losing. It was the safety of not being alone with her own ghosts. At night, I could hear her murmuring in her restless sleep. Sometimes she whispered her daughter's name, sometimes fragments of excuses. It wasn't me. I didn't mean it. In those moments, my chest burned with the old grief of my husband's death, but I also felt the heavy weight of witnessing divine justice unfold within my own home. It was a punishment I had not asked to see, yet could not turn away from. We no longer fought. We barely spoke. We simply existed, two broken souls under the same roof. She mourned the loss of her fortune and her sins. I mourned the loss of my husband and the cruel irony of having to care for the woman who had helped destroy my peace. And in those silent evenings, the only bridge left between us was a single cup of tea I had quietly set before her, a fragile, bitter symbol of everything we had both lost.
Those dinners, sitting opposite one another at that tiny kitchen table, began to feel like funeral rites. She ate the simple bulgur pilaf, the very dish she had once sneered at as peasant food, with her head bowed, spooning it in small, shame-faced mouthfuls as if she knew she didn't deserve it. That silence between us was the bitterest bite we both had to swallow. There was nothing left to talk about, no shared ground, no future to plan together. When my kindly neighbors knocked and offered a hot bowl of stew, I could no longer welcome them in the old, easy way and say, "Come in, have a coffee." I cracked the door just enough and lied, "I'm sorry, I have an unwell guest," because I simply could not bear to show anyone the pitiful sight of the sister who had once been famed for her wealth. I could not bear to have my shame become their talk. One day, I asked her to get up and rinse a glass. Her hands, used to porcelain and crystal, gripped my plain tumbler with such fear that when it slipped and smashed in the sink, she froze as if she had committed a crime. The woman who had never cared for million-pound vases trembled now, expecting me to shout and throw her out for breaking a 1-pound glass. I didn't shout. I didn't scold. I simply picked up the old broom and said coldly, "Move aside and be useful. You'll cut yourself." My icy calm struck her harder than any slap. With that broken glass, she understood again how useless, how clumsy,
and how utterly dependent on my mercy she had become. When she drew back into her corner, there was nothing left of the lady Vivienne once was. She was in my house, eating my bread and drinking my water, and she could not even wash a glass. She was a living ghost taking up space, and I, by virtue of an old blood tie, was obliged to give that ghost a place beneath my roof. Months passed. The woman on the sofa wasted away not only in spirit but in body. Her complexion, once radiant from expensive creams, grew sallow. Her proud shoulders slumped inward. The finest silk dresses hung loose around a frame that seemed to be losing its substance. Pride had eaten her from within like some slow disease. There were times when I would call, "Vivienne, the dinner's getting cold," and she would not hear me. She seemed no longer in the room, but lost somewhere in the dark corridors of her past, fixed for hours at a meaningless crack in the wall or a worn pattern in the carpet. In those moments, I felt the fragile threads of her mind fray one by one. The nights grew worse. I woke to muffled screams from the old sofa. "Get away from me! I didn't do it!" I would rush to her and find her the same way each time, eyes wide with terror, drenched in sweat, pointing to a dark corner of the room and whispering, "I saw it! It was there! It came to accuse me!" There was no one in that corner but the two of us and her agonized conscience. She no longer refused the food she had once scorned, not because her tastes had changed, but because she had become unable to feed herself. Those diamond ring hands could not even hold a spoon. I, who had once been scorned by her for not lending a hospital fee, now sat opposite her and fed her with a spoon as one might feed a baby. Yogurt, soup, anything to keep something down. It was the cruelest test fate had laid upon me. From the day she took refuge in my home, I became more than just a householder. I was her carer, her nurse, the only witness to the horrors that haunted her. She had been my enemy, the woman who had wounded me most deeply. Now she was helpless, losing her mind, relying on my mercy. For the sake of our mother's memory, when the screams that filled the nights and the hollow silences that haunted the days became more than I could bear, I did the only thing left to do with the last grain of mercy in me. I called the old neighborhood doctor, my late husband's friend. The figure sitting on that sofa was no longer my proud sister. She was a patient lost in the labyrinth of her own broken mind. He examined her for a long time. The woman who had once been treated in the finest private clinics now slumped on my worn sofa, then turned to me with weary eyes. "Mrs. Margaret, this isn't grief or regret anymore. Her mind is gone. It's a complete collapse. She can't be cared for at home. She needs to be admitted, either a private facility or a psychiatric ward. This is too heavy a burden for one person to carry." His words echoed against the walls of my small house, and something old and angry rose again inside me. This wasn't my test. This wasn't supposed to be my burden. So I took up that wretched, expensive phone of hers, the last relic of her former life, and called her daughter, the cold-voiced woman who had once said, "Don't call me again." If anyone deserved to know what had become of her mother, it was the child she had sacrificed everything for. When the girl finally answered hours later, her voice was polite, poised, and utterly frigid. "Yes, Annie?" I told her everything, how her mother screamed through the nights, how the doctor had said she'd lost her mind, how she needed to be placed somewhere safe. And without a second's hesitation, that well-bred voice replied, "Auntie, that woman isn't my mother anymore. I won't destroy my marriage over her madness. Please don't call me about this again." Then the line went dead. The click of that phone, the flat beep, beep, beep of the disconnection rang in my small sitting room like a sentence. In that sound, I understood. Vivienne's precious daughter, the one she had disowned her family for, hadn't just left her mother in the street. She had abandoned her to madness and death without blinking. And fate, in its cruel symmetry, had laid the ruins of this woman, my hateful, broken sister, squarely upon my shoulders, inside my modest little home. When the words, "She's not my mother anymore," stamped themselves onto my heart, I realized I was trapped in this dead end alone. Then I heard our late mother's old saying in my head, "A sister may be your wolf, but she's still your refuge." And so I made my choice. I would do what her unfeeling daughter would not. However much she had hurt me, she was still my blood. I would not cast her into the streets. I would carry this burden to the end. Though the doctor's words, "mental hospital," echoed in my ears, I couldn't bring myself to send her to those cold, unfamiliar walls among the forsaken. My days no longer belonged to cooking or dusting, but to cleaning her, feeding her, tending to the body that sat slumped on that sofa like a plant deprived of sun. Each spoonful I raised to her lips, each soiled sheet I changed, I searched her dull eyes for even a spark of the proud sister I had once known. I stopped visiting neighbors, stopped going to the market. I couldn't leave her alone for fear she'd hurt herself or forget the gas was on. She was a prisoner of her failing mind. I was the keeper, bound to her by duty, fear, and something that no longer resembled love. We were both captives of that house, two ghosts chained to the same past. Sometimes the silence grew so heavy it felt as though I were living in a graveyard. I would sit across from her and tell her stories of our childhood, the smell of our mother's bread, the games we played in the yard. I knew she couldn't understand, but I spoke anyway, hoping that somewhere, buried deep inside, a flicker of the old Vivienne still heard me. And at night, when she finally fell into uneasy sleep, I would look at her sunken face and think about the terrible justice life had dealt her. She had lost everything she ever worshipped, her fortune, her daughter, even her mind. Death would have been kinder. Now she lived trapped in the twilight between worlds, neither alive nor gone, a suffering soul caught forever in the purgatory of my quiet little living room.
The months blurred together, and that old sofa ceased to be the seat of my proud sister. It became the final stop for a body that still breathed, but no longer lived. When the woman who once turned up her nose at the finest dishes could no longer summon the strength to open her mouth for a spoonful of soup, when her vacant eyes fixed on one meaningless point on the ceiling, I knew then that I was no longer feeding a person, only the fading memory of a sinful past. Even the night screams that had once shaken the walls were gone. The silence that replaced them was worse, heavier, crueler. It wasn't peace. It was exhaustion. Her soul had simply run out of the strength to suffer. The last spark of life inside her was flickering out. When the kind old neighborhood doctor came through the door for the final time, he didn't look at the wasted woman on the sofa. He looked at me, at my hunched shoulders and sleepless, bloodshot eyes. "Margaret," he said softly, "there's nothing more medicine can do. You've given this woman the mercy her own daughter never did, the humanity she forgot. All that's left is to make sure she goes peacefully." In those last days, when I looked at her hollowed face and sunken cheeks, I could no longer see the sister I had hated, the arrogant, dazzling woman who once lorded over us all. What lay before me was only a small, broken creature who had suffered enough, who had paid her dues in this life and then some, and I knew that her presence in my home was a test, the final bitter battle between my mercy and my resentment. That last evening, as the sun slipped into my modest sitting room, I took her hand, the same hand that had once been adorned with diamonds and had dismissed me with disdain. It was cold now, thin and trembling. Holding it, I thought of the hand I could not hold years ago, my husband's, as he died alone in that hospital corridor. And I felt, with cruel clarity, that fate was settling its accounts, that it was making me witness my greatest enemy's final breath in the same way I had once been forced to witness my greatest loss. By dawn, when the first birds began to stir, the ragged sound of her breathing stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, it sliced through my fatigue like a knife. I rose, and there she was, the once beautiful, once powerful Vivienne, lying on the same creaking sofa she had despised, her proud face now nothing but fragile bone and stillness. She had taken her last breath quietly, without witness, without grandeur, alone. Looking down at that frail face, I didn't think of my husband's death, nor of the cruelty she'd shown me. There was no anger left in me. What lay there was neither arrogance nor hatred, only the remains of a woman who had been punished more harshly than death itself. A soul abandoned by her child, stripped of everything she thought defined her. I reached out and gently closed her eyes. When I called her daughter, I said simply, "Your mother passed away this morning." There was a pause, not of grief, but of relief. That cold voice replied, "I'll take care of the arrangements, Auntie. Don't trouble yourself." And in that tone, I heard it clearly. Her mother's death was not a loss to her, only the end of an inconvenience. At the funeral, there were no friends from her glittering past, no daughter in black with crocodile tears. The woman who built her life on appearances left behind nothing but a name barely legible on a cold, cheap stone. When I returned home, I folded the blanket, straightened the sofa, and listened to the silence that filled the room. She had been devoured by very world she'd worshipped, by false love, pride, and money. And I, the sister she had mocked for her small life, had been the only one there at the end, to hold her hand, to close her eyes, to bear witness. That day, I finally understood what life had been trying to teach her and me all along. No matter how rich you are, no matter what empire you build, when the end comes, the only hands that will give you your last sip of water belong not to those you bought with money, but to those who act out of conscience. And it had taken my proud sister a lifetime and her mind to learn that truth.